The sea has always been governed by rules. Some were written to save lives, preserve order, and ensure safe passage across treacherous waters. But others were so spectacularly idiotic, so divorced from logic and common sense, that they endangered the very sailors they were meant to protect. From admiralty boards that banned life-saving equipment to port authorities obsessed with hat regulations, maritime history is littered with rules that make you wonder how humanity ever crossed a puddle, let alone an ocean. We've dredged up 50 of the most brain-meltingly dumb maritime rules ever enforced. Tell us in the comments which seafaring nation you think had the worst sailors. And let's set sail into stupidity. 1. In 1790, the British Royal Navy implemented a regulation requiring all sailors to remove their shoes before climbing the rigging during storms. The Admiralty's reasoning was that wet shoes were slippery and dangerous. The problem? Bare feet on ice-covered ropes in the North Atlantic were exponentially more dangerous. The rule was responsible for dozens of men losing their grip and plummeting to their deaths before it was quietly abandoned. Apparently, frostbite and broken necks were preferable to slightly damp. Footwear. 2. The Port of Hamburg, in 1623, enacted a rule that all incoming merchant vessels had to fire their cannons 3 times before docking as a greeting to the harbor master. Unfortunately, gunpowder was expensive, and many captains used minimal charges. This resulted in cannonballs barely rolling out of the barrels and sinking harmless into the water, defeating the entire ceremonial purpose. One thrifty Dutch captain was fined for firing blanks. The harbor master claimed he could tell by the sound and felt personally disrespected. 3. During the 1850s, Australian port authorities in Sydney required that every ship arriving from overseas display a yellow quarantine flag if anyone on board was ill. Reasonable enough, except the rule also stated that if the ship didn't have a yellow flag, they had to fly a white bedsheet. If they had neither, they were required to hang a crew member's yellow shirt from the mast. One ship was detained for 3 days because their makeshift yellow shirt wasn't deemed sufficiently yellow by the port. Inspectors. Standards. 4. A French naval regulation from 1702 mandated that all officers must duel with swords to resolve disputes rather than fists, as fisticuffs were considered undignified. This rule was enforced even on crowded ship decks during active combat. Several captains were court-martialed, not for losing battles, but for punching a subordinate instead of formally challenging them to a sword fight, because nothing says military efficiency like requiring paperwork and seconds before you can discipline someone. 5. The Spanish Armada had a rule in 1588 that forbade sailors from learning to swim. The logic was that if sailors knew how to swim, they'd be more likely to abandon ship during battle instead of fighting to the end. This catastrophic policy meant that when ships sank, thousands of men drowned within sight of shore, flailing uselessly because their own navy had prohibited the one skill that could have saved them. What's the dumbest safety rule you've ever encountered at work? 6. In 1821, the U.S. Navy introduced a regulation requiring all sailors to wear their hair in a queue, a long braid down the back, greased with tar and fat. The stated purpose was uniformity and tradition. The actual result was a shipboard lice epidemic so severe that the Navy had to eventually issue a mass head-shaving order. The queue rule remained official policy for another 3 years, even after the lice crisis, because changing regulations required an act of Congress. 7. Portuguese maritime law in the 16th century required that every ship carry a priest, and that priest had veto power over navigation decisions if he deemed them sinful. One priest famously refused to let his captain sail on a Sunday, delaying a spice shipment by a week. Another forbade the ship from docking in a port known for its brothels, forcing the crew to anchor 3 miles offshore and row in for supplies. Moral authority. Meet maritime logistics. 8. The Dutch East India Company in 1640 had a rule that any sailor caught whistling on deck would be flogged. The superstition was that whistling summoned storms. The problem was that many work songs and coordinating signals involved whistling. Bosuns had to develop elaborate hand signals and humming codes to direct work crews. One ship's log records a man receiving 12 lashes for unconsciously whistling while scrubbing the deck during dead calm weather. 9. aka British regulation from 1805 required that all naval vessels carry a specific ratio of rum to water for the daily grog ration. The rule was so precise that ships had to carry official measuring cups, and any deviation could result in the quartermaster's court-martial. During one campaign, a ship ran out of rum, but had plenty of whiskey captured from a French vessel. The captain couldn't legally substitute it without written permission from the Admiralty. The crew nearly mutinied while the captain waited 3 weeks for a reply, authorizing the switch. 10. In 1912, just months after the Titanic disaster, the Board of Trade introduced a regulation requiring all British passenger ships to carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Sensible, right? Except the rule included a bizarre clause that the lifeboats had to be painted white and stored in a specific order by size. One cruise line was fined, not because they lacked lifeboats, but because their lifeboats were painted cream instead of pure white. Priorities, people. 11. The Venetian Republic in 1450 required all galley slaves to be branded on the forehead with the ship's registration number. The intent was to prevent escape and ensure proper accounting. The unintended consequence was that freed slaves couldn't reintegrate into society and often returned to crime, creating a permanent criminal underclass. Eventually, Venice had to open a special clinic to remove the brands, which cost the state more than the original branding. Program 12, Russian Imperial and Navy regulations from 1888 stated that any officer who lost his hat overboard was required to file a formal incident report explaining the circumstances and apologizing to the Tsar for the disrespect to the uniform. One lieutenant's hat blew off during a typhoon. He spent 4 hours after the storm drafting a 3-page explanation that had to be countersigned by his captain, the admiral, and eventually forwarded to St. Petersburg. The Navy's bureaucratic priorities were truly awe-inspiring. 13. A Swedish maritime law from 1720 required that any captain who discovered new land had to immediately plant the Swedish flag and name the territory after a member of the royal family. The problem was that Sweden had a very large royal family, and captains kept running out of unused royal names. One explorer discovered 3 small islands in the Baltic and named them after the king's 3rd cousin, his cousin's wife, and their infant daughter in that order. The islands were later determined to be the same island at different tides. 14. The U.S. Coast Guard in 1935 introduced a rule requiring all rescued individuals to sign a liability waiver before being brought aboard the rescue vessel. The logic was to protect the service from lawsuits. In practice, it meant Coast Guardsmen were handing clipboards and pens to people clinging to wreckage in freezing water. The rule was abandoned after a newspaper published a photo of a hypothermic fisherman trying to sign paperwork while barely conscious. Have you ever had to sign something at the worst possible moment? 15. British naval regulations during the Napoleonic Wars required that all amputations performed at sea be witnessed and documented by 3 officers. The intent was to prevent fraudulent injury claims. The reality was that during major battles, surgeons couldn't operate because they couldn't find 3 officers who weren't actively fighting. Men bled out, waiting for the proper paperwork witnesses. One surgeon was court-martialed for performing an emergency amputation with only 2 witnesses present, despite saving the sailor's life. 16. The Ottoman Navy in the 17th century had a rule that captains could not alter course without consulting the ship's astrologer. If the astrologer was asleep, seasick, or dead, the ship had to maintain its current heading until he was available. One Ottoman warship famously sailed in a straight line for 16 hours through a merchant shipping lane, nearly causing multiple collisions because the astrologer had eaten bad fish and was incapacitated. 17. In 1803, the Royal Navy mandated that all sailors must attend mandatory Sunday church services on deck, regardless of weather. During one winter service in the North Sea, over 40 men developed pneumonia from standing in freezing rain for a 2-hour sermon. The chaplain, who delivered the service from the covered quarterdeck, wrote in his journal that the men's devotion was inspiring and their suffering was spiritually purifying. 18. Japanese maritime law during the Edo period, 1603-1868, forbade the construction of any ship large enough to sail to foreign countries. The shogunate was so paranoid about foreign influence that they legally limited ship size, making ocean-going vessels illegal. This meant Japanese fishing boats were deliberately unseaworthy for anything beyond coastal waters. Hundreds of fishermen were swept out to sea and died because their boats were legally required to be be too small to handle storms. 19. A regulation in the Prussian Navy from 1870 required all officers to have dueling scars on their faces as proof of courage and honor. Officers without scars were passed over for promotion. This led to elaborate staged dueling parties where young officers would intentionally slash each other's cheeks. Some officers who refused to participate on moral grounds had their careers destroyed. The rule created a generation of commanders selected not for tactical brilliance, but for facial scarring. 20. The Port of London in 1725 had a rule that no ship could unload cargo on the Sabbath. Fair enough for a religious society. However, the rule specified that Sabbath began at sunset on Saturday. Ships that arrived at 6 p.m. on Saturday had to wait until Monday morning to unload, sitting fully loaded with perishable goods. One shipment of French cheese rotted completely in the hold over a summer weekend because the captain arrived 2 hours before the Sabbath deadline and couldn't get a berth in time. 21. During World War I, the German Imperial Navy had a regulation that submarines could only attack enemy vessels after surfacing and giving a formal warning. This rule, intended to show honorable warfare, completely negated the primary advantage of submarines: surprise. U-boat captains who surfaced to issue warnings were frequently fired upon by the enemy ships they'd courteously alerted. The rule was quietly abandoned after several submarines were sunk while politely announcing their intentions. 22. A Danish maritime law from 1690 required that all sailors convicted of theft at sea be punished by keel-hauling, being dragged under the ship's hull on a rope. The rule specified that the punishment had to be performed 3 times to be official. The problem was that most men didn't survive the first keel-hauling. Captains were then in the awkward position of having to keel-haul corpses twice more to comply with regulations. The paperwork noted the punishment as completed posthumously. 23. The East India Company mandated in 1780 that all tea shipments to England be stored in the ship's hold beneath the waterline to keep it cool and dry. Sound logic, except this rule applied even when ships were also carrying gunpowder, which was required by a different regulation to be stored in the lowest hold for safety. This meant gunpowder was under the tea, making any leak or spark catastrophic. Several ships exploded in port because 2 different bureaucrats wrote contradictory storage rules, and nobody bothered to reconcile them. What's the most contradictory set of rules you've had to follow? 24. In 1845, British maritime law required all passenger ships to provide adequate toilet facilities, but defined adequate as 1 toilet per 100 passengers. On immigrant ships to America carrying 800 people in steerage, this meant exactly 8 toilets. During the 6-week voyage, the predictable sanitation nightmare led to cholera outbreaks that killed more passengers than shipwrecks. The law wasn't changed until 1855, after a decade of documented epidemics. 25. A French regulation from 1755 required naval officers to powder their wigs daily, even during combat. The rules specified the type of powder, the style of the wig, and even the scent. Officers who appeared on deck with unpowdered wigs faced fines and official reprimands. During the Battle of Quiberon Bay, one captain was criticized in official reports for having disheveled hair during the engagement, overshadowing his actual tactical performance. 26. The Spanish treasure fleet had a rule in the 1600s that forbade captains from deviating from the official route, even to avoid hurricanes. The mandated sailing schedule and route were set by administrators in Madrid who had never been to sea. Ships were required to sail during hurricane season because the bureaucratic calendar said so. Dozens of treasure galleons sank with millions in gold because captains weren't allowed to wait out storms or take safer routes without facing court-martial for disobedience. 27. Russian regulations in 1910 required all naval vessels to carry a portrait of the Tsar in the captain's quarters, and the portrait had to be saluted every time an officer entered the room. On battleships with frequent meetings, officers spent more time saluting portraits than discussing tactics. One destroyer captain was court-martialed because his steward had hung the portrait half an inch too low, which was deemed a treasonous insult to the Tsars. Dignity. 28. The Republic of Genoa in 1492 had a maritime law requiring that all cargo, Disputes be settled by weighing the contested goods on official port scales, reasonable for grain or salt, absurd for live animals, liquids, or perishable fish. One dispute over a shipment of live eels took 3 days to resolve because the eels kept escaping the scale. By the time a judgment was rendered, most of the eels were dead, and both merchant and captain lost money. 29. British naval regulations from 1815 required that all sailors killed in action be buried at sea with full honours, including a reading from the Book of Common Prayer. However, the rule also stated that burials could not be performed during active combat. On ships engaged in multi-day battles, this meant corpses were stored on deck, often for days, waiting for a lull in the fighting. The morale effect of fighting alongside decomposing comrades was never officially acknowledged. 30. In 1920, Prohibition created a bizarre American maritime rule. U.S. Navy ships were completely dry, but foreign naval vessels visiting American ports could keep their alcohol. This led to American sailors sneaking aboard British ships for drinks, and British sailors selling rum to Americans at ridiculous markups. The rule also meant that on joint exercises, Allied sailors could drink while their American counterparts watched. Morale was predictably terrible. 31. A Dutch maritime regulation from 1670 required that any sailor who sighted a whale had to report it to the captain within 5 minutes or face a fine. The intent was to maximize whaling opportunities. The practical effect was that lookouts became obsessed with whale spotting and frequently misidentified logs, dolphins, and waves as whales. One ship's log records 43 false whale sightings in a single day, with the captain eventually confining the overzealous lookout to quarters for wasting everyone's time. 32. The Confederate Navy during the American Civil War had a regulation requiring all officers to be gentlemen, of good breeding and character, which specifically excluded anyone who had worked in trade or manual labor. This eliminated most experienced sailors and shipwrights from command positions. The Confederacy had plenty of aristocratic officers who'd never been to sea commanding ships built by men who weren't allowed to be officers. The strategic brilliance of this approach is evident in the South's naval. Record 33. Portuguese. Maritime law in 1550 required that all ships carry a notary to document the division of prize. Money from captured vessels. The notary received a percentage of all prizes. This created a perverse incentive where notaries would encourage piracy and aggressive boarding actions to increase their income. Some ships carried notaries who actively lobbied the captain to attack anything that floated. One notary was thrown overboard by the crew after he suggested attacking a Spanish warship 3 times their size because the paperwork would be exceptional. 34. A Soviet Navy regulation from 1960 required that all officers submit weekly written self-criticisms detailing their ideological shortcomings and failures to embody communist principles. On submarines during extended patrols, this meant officers spent hours in cramped quarters writing confessional essays about insufficient devotion to Marxist-Leninist thought. One submarine captain's self-criticism was rejected because it wasn't self-critical enough, and he had to rewrite it to be more condemnatory of himself. The psychological effects of mandatory self-loathing on crews operating nuclear weapons were apparently not a concern. 35. In 1787, the Royal Navy introduced a regulation requiring all ships to carry lime juice to prevent scurvy, which was brilliant and saved countless lives. However, a bureaucratic amendment in 1799 specified that the lime juice could be substituted with lemon juice, which could be substituted with lime cordial, which could be substituted with basically any citrus-flavored liquid a supplier wanted to sell the Navy. By 1810, ships were carrying anti-scorbutic solution that was mostly sugar water with a hint of lime flavoring. Scurvy returned with a vengeance because bureaucrats had loopholed a working solution into uselessness. Ever seen a good rule destroyed by modifications? 36. The Italian Navy in 1911 had a regulation that officers must wear white gloves during all official duties. This included gunnery practice. Officers were literally trying to load and aim naval artillery while wearing formal white gloves to maintain proper decorum. The gloves were constantly destroyed, leading to a thriving black market market in white gloves. One officer was reprimanded because his gloves were yellowed from gunpowder residue, which was deemed unsightly, owing a rule that prioritized formation over safety. 37. A regulation in the Hanseatic League from 1400 required that all member ships traveling together must stay within visual distance of each other at all times. In fog or storms, this meant ships would slow to a crawl or even anchor in dangerous waters rather than lose sight of the fleet. The rule was intended to provide mutual protection, but it actually increased danger by forcing ships to cluster in poor visibility. Multiple collisions occurred because ships were following, a rule that prioritized formation over safety. 38. The United States Navy in 1850 had a regulation forbidding sailors from having tattoos of women, as they were considered obscene. However, tattoos of mermaids were explicitly permitted because mermaids were considered mythological creatures, not women. This led to elaborate legal debates about whether a mermaid with a highly realistic female upper body counted as a woman or a fish. Courts martial were convened to examine sailors' arms and render verdicts on the womanliness of their inked mermaids. 39. British maritime law in the 1700s stated that any cargo of tea damaged by seawater during transport could not be sold in England but could be legally dumped in the colonies. This led to American ports being flooded with semi-spoiled tea that British merchants couldn't sell at home. The practice created terrible tea quality in the colonies while protecting British consumers. Historians now suggest this predatory tea dumping was an underappreciated contributor to colonial resentment and possibly even the Boston Tea Party. 40. The Imperial Japanese Navy before World War II had a regulation that officers could not surrender under any circumstances and must commit ritual suicide rather than be captured. This rule was enforced so rigidly that when ships sank, officers would drown themselves in their cabins rather than swim to safety. The regulation cost Japan hundreds of experienced officers whose expertise could never be replaced. Cultures that glorify death over tactical retreat rarely fare well in prolonged wars. 41. A French regulation from 1680 required that all naval vessels fly specific signal flags indicating the captain's noble rank. The problem was that enemy ships could read these signals too, allowing them to identify and target flagships and command vessels. French admirals were essentially required to paint targets on their ships to satisfy aristocratic protocol. Multiple fleet commanders were killed because their own regulations advertised their location to enemy. Gunners 42, the port of Amsterdam in 1650, required all foreign ships to pay docking fees in Dutch guilders. Fair enough. Except the rule also stated that currency exchange could only be performed by official port money changers, who were allowed to charge up to 30% commission. Foreign captains were legally forced to use extortionate money changers, turning docking fees into highway robbery. The rule was finally abolished after multiple nations threatened to embargo Amsterdam entirely. 43. During the War of 1812, the U.S. Navy had a regulation that prize money from captured British vessels would be distributed according to rank, with the captain receiving 40 shares, lieutenants receiving 8 shares, and common sailors receiving half a share. This meant that crews doing the actual fighting had almost no financial incentive. Mutinies and desertions became so common that the Navy had to revise the system, but not before dozens of ships lost crew members, who quite reasonably decided the risk-reward ratio was insane. 44. Bizarre Swedish regulation from 1790 required that all naval officers be able to dance the minuet, waltz, and polonaise to professional standards. The reasoning was that officers would represent Sweden at foreign courts and must uphold the nation's cultural reputation. Officers were tested annually, and failure meant being passed over for promotion. The Swedish Navy thus selected commanders based partially on their footwork. One brilliant tactician was denied advancement because he had 2 left feet. 45. British maritime law in 1880 required that all ships carry cats to control rats. Sensible. However, the law specified 1 cat per 100 tons of cargo. Large cargo ships were therefore legally required to carry dozens of cats. One vessel weighing 5,000 tons had to house 50 cats, which created a floating cat colony that fought constantly, bred uncontrollably, and consumed more of the food stores than the rats they were supposed to catch. The ship arrived in port with 73 cats and a traumatized crew of 46. The Spanish Navy in the 16th century had a rule that all charts and maps were state secrets and had to be locked in the captain's cabin when not in use. Navigators who needed to plot courses had to request the charts, use them under supervision, and return them immediately. During emergencies, this meant navigators were trying to avoid reefs and rocks from memory because they weren't allowed unsupervised access to their own maps. Several ships ran aground because of this paranoid security protocol. 47. An American regulation from 1925 required all merchant vessels to carry a radio operator, which was a good safety rule. However, it also specified that the radio operator must be on duty only during specific hours, and those hours were set by bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., not by ship's captains. This meant that ships in distress outside of official radio hours had operators who were legally off duty and not required to monitor emergency channels. The SS Titanic's disaster had already demonstrated the importance of 24-hour radio watch, but regulations lagged behind reality by decades. 48. The Venetian Navy in 1500 required that all galley rowers be given a daily wine ration to maintain morale. However, a cost-cutting measure in 1503 changed the regulation to require the wine to be mixed with seawater to extend supplies. Sailors were being given intentionally salted wine, which increased thirst and dehydration. The galley's rowing efficiency dropped so dramatically that Venice had to abandon the practice after losing several rowing crews to heat exhaustion during summer campaigns. Who approved giving dehydrated rowers salt water? 49. A regulation in the Royal Canadian Navy during the 1950s required that all official communications be drafted in both English and French, including emergency signals. During exercises, ships in distress had to broadcast their Mayday calls in both languages in alternating sentences. This wasn't a problem in calm scenarios, but during actual emergencies, having to translate your distress call in real time while your ship was sinking was darkly comedic. The rule was modified after a captain radioed, "We're sinking. Nous coulons. Send help. Envoyez de l'aide." Seriously, just send anyone. Sérieusement, envoyez n'importe qui. 50. Perhaps the dumbest maritime rule in history comes from the British Board of Trade in 1911, after the Titanic disaster in 1912 proved that ships needed lifeboats for everyone on board. The board updated the regulations. However, the new rule calculated lifeboat requirements based on a ship's gross tonnage, not passenger capacity. This meant that a ship could legally carry 3,000 passengers, but only be required to have lifeboat capacity for 1,500 if its tonnage fell below a certain threshold. The rule was supposedly designed to save ships money. Instead, it codified the exact conditions that had made the Titanic disaster so deadly, ensuring that future ships would be just as unprepared. The regulation wasn't fully corrected until 1914, after 2 more years of preventable deaths. And there you have it, 50 maritime rules that prove humanity's relationship with the sea has always been complicated by our talent for bureaucratic self-sabotage. From admirals who prioritized wig powder over tactics, to regulations that turned life-saving equipment into legal footnotes. These rules remind us that the most dangerous waters aren't always the ones on the map. Before you go, we need to settle this. Which of these 50 rules was the absolute dumbest? Was it the Spanish treasure fleet sailing straight into hurricanes, the Russian Navy saluting portraits during battles, or the British calculating lifeboat capacity by tonnage instead of human lives? Cast your vote in the comments. And if these nautical nightmares kept you entertained, throw us a like and subscribe so you never miss our next deep dive into historical disasters. Thanks for watching, and remember, when in doubt, don't let bureaucrats design your safety equipment.